Hello and welcome to State of the Economy. Today we have with us Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, Director General of Institute of Applied Manpower Research under the Planning Commission, and this institute has done a lot of work in understanding the structure of employment and generally the changing structure of the rural economy, the shift from rural to urban of people. So we will have a discussion on these issues. Welcome to our show, Dr. Mehrotra. I will begin by asking you a framing question in regard to how do you see the change in the employment structure in India over the last 10 years as reflected in the recent NSS data, which your institute has also analyzed very closely. And there's just one aspect which I want you to focus on, which is the NSS data shows that from roughly 2005 to 2009, which is the boom period in the Indian economy as well as the world economy, the addition to employment has been rather meager, roughly I think 1.5 to 2 million, whereas after 2009, for 2 years, 2009 2011, there's a big increase in employment, about 13 million. Now, how do you explain this phenomenon?
Well, there's no question that the employment structure is undergoing significant changes along with economic growth. You know, in all the way up to the year 2000, we weren't seeing much significant change in the employment structure. Yeah. You know, you had seen growth, GDP growth, and you had seen output structure changes. Yes, until 2000 there was
no big break in the
employment
shifts in the employment structure.
That's correct. In the since you've asked me to focus on the period 2005 onwards, I do need to sort of, I will come to that in a second.
You can look at 2000 to 2010 also.
Yes. So I think what one needs to examine is what happened to employment between 2000 and 2005, because total employment did increase by about 60 million, which is quite significant because in the preceding period, which means from 93 to 2000, it had not been as much. Now, we shouldn't be too impressed by this increase in employment that we saw in the first half of the decade, because 20 million of the 60 million was actually in agriculture, which is not good news at all.
You mean the increase in employment was in agriculture, 20 million?
That's right. 20 of the 60 million was in agriculture, which is distress employment, because you don't want to see, given the stage that our economy is reaching, we are a middle income country, our GDP is growing rapidly, you would expect structural change in employment as well as in output. So structural change in output is taking place, but not enough, was not taking place enough in employment.
Meaning from agriculture to industry and services.
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
That's the dramatic shift that begins from the year 2005 onwards, 2004-05, where for the first time in the history of India, total employment in agriculture actually declined. You see, the share of agriculture had been systematically declining in total employment even earlier.
Even in GDP, yeah.
GDP, of course, it was declining and employment is declining. However, now that you've pointed that out, I think one thing that we need to policymakers need to focus our attention on is that even today in 2011-12, 49% of total employment in the economy is still accounted for by agriculture, while output is only 14 to 15% accounted. So, 14 to 15% output being accounted for by half of the workforce is not good news. Productivity is very low, people need to move out.
But coming back to 2005 onwards.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. Yeah. So, what I'm saying is that it's very good news that we saw an absolute decline in employment in agriculture.
By how much? About 20 million?
No, 14 million in the second half of the decade, 2005 to 2010, and an additional 13 million decline from 2009-10 to 2011-12 in a 2-year period. So you're saying dramatic.
First time ever,
yes,
employment in agriculture actually declined.
Absolute terms.
After 2005.
Absolute.
So would you regard this as some sort of inflection point in the shift in the structure of employment?
Almost certainly. I mean, we had predicted when we were writing the chapters on the 12th five-year plan on employment that this is going to intensify, and I was very delighted to notice that the NSS data for 2011-12 shows very clearly that process has intensified. And the people who are leaving are mainly, landless agricultural labor. So you can well ask the question, where is the employment
Can you
growing?
give me just one data piece? How much has employment in agriculture declined in absolute terms from 2005 until 2011?
12. So it's a total of 27 million decline.
So 27 million people have moved out of agriculture since 2005.
That's absolutely right. So the total number has come down just after 2005 from about 250 odd million to about 223 million.
So does this also signify in your assessment that agriculture, during this period, agriculture productivity and agriculture output has also been consistently
rising?
Good. Yeah, rising.
Well,
so is it mechanization happening, lesser people in agriculture producing more output, and therefore moving those people moving into industry and services?
There has certainly been some improvement in productivity. Agricultural growth has been good. Output has improved. Certainly in the 11th plan period, we saw a 3.2% per annum increase in agricultural output, which is much better than the preceding plan. And you're absolutely right. There is a fair bit of mechanization happening, even in states like UP and Bihar, which is quite remarkable. That if earlier, 5-6 years ago, hoeing and sowing would be done manually, today the hoeing is being done by tractor. The bell and the buffalo, is no more to be seen. There's an absolute decline in cattle, etc. And similarly at threshing time and harvest time, when the threshing is done, especially of wheat, it's being done by these mechanical threshers.
So this you're seeing across the northern belt, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, it was obviously happening a lot in Punjab and in other states, which agricultural dominant, agriculturally dynamic states. But it's happening even in UP and Bihar. That's the good news.
This is interesting. We will be back, but after a small break. Please don't go away. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with Dr. Santosh Mehrotra, DG of the Institute of Applied Manpower Research under the Planning Commission. Mr. Mehrotra, you were pointing out something interesting, which is that some of the laggard states in agriculture until about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, UP, Bihar, are showing similar characteristics as Punjab and maybe Andhra Pradesh, agriculturally more advanced in the sense that they more mechanization of agriculture happening there. So now, taking that as a fact, how do you then explain manufacturing? If agriculture employment is declining in absolute terms, as you mentioned, between 2005 and 2012, one would have assumed that employment should have increased in manufacturing. But the data shows that even in manufacturing, employment has declined. Now then, where are the workers going?
Right.
So, isn't this a bit of a puzzle?
It's not so much of a puzzle, because please remember that when workers leave agriculture, these are relatively unskilled workers, unskilled as far as non-agricultural economic activity is concerned. So the good news is that infrastructure investment has really boomed after 2004-05. And especially in the 11th five-year plan period, which ran from 2007 to 2012, we saw an increase of infrastructure investment of $500 billion. Sure. So you can see...
in this period, infrastructure investment as a ratio of GDP also increased by about...
Dramatically.
About 3%, yeah.
Exactly. Dramatically. It went up from about 4% of GDP in 2007 to 7.5% of GDP. Yeah. So this is where the workers are getting absorbed. Okay. Now, something very interesting is happening as a result of this. This process had begun in the first half of...
You're saying this is not getting captured in manufacturing, right?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
it's not manufacturing. We'll come to manufacturing in a few minutes, but it's important to sort of capture the good news here again. This is the second bit of good news, I think, on the employment side that we're seeing, other than the absolute decline in agricultural employment. So, because of the massive increase in infrastructure investment, which we had predicted, in fact, even a year ago, that because it is going to get sustained, you are going to continue to see significant increases in construction employment. That's precisely what has happened even after 2010, between 2009-10 and 2011-12. The most recent data is suggesting there's a significant, at least 4 or 5 million increase in construction employment. Again, hardly surprising, and this is going to continue because in the 12th plan, we are committed to increasing infrastructure investment from $500 billion in the 11th plan to $1 trillion and taking it up to 9.5% of GDP in the 12th plan. So that's what's happening. Now let's come to manufacturing, which was your earlier question. Manufacturing clearly was a worry between 2005 and 2010, which saw an absolute decline in manufacturing
employment. How much is the decline?
From 55 million to 50 million.
Okay.
5 million decline, 10% in
so 5 million decline
manufacturing.
In manufacturing and about 14 million in agriculture, right?
Correct. So, which was all reflected in an increase in services employment, but even services employment unfortunately didn't increase very much in the between 2005 and 2010.
Didn't increase enough to cover either.
Well,
decline in
right,
manufacturing or
construction captured most of that. So, but the good news is that most recent data, the 68th round, which was just released literally a week or 10 days ago, from the NSS, shows very clearly that even services employment has picked up, manufacturing employment has picked up, and construction employment.
For the 2 years after 2009.
Yes. So that's fairly good news. But if you're interested in understanding why manufacturing employment dipped between 2005
why such swings?
Yes, well, particularly, I think we have to delve a little deeper into the data and into the dynamics here. You see, something very important happened in the economy, which had economy-wide effects at the beginning of 2006, the start of MGNREGA. Prior to 2006, agricultural wages had remained flat. Thanks to MGNREGA, the beginning of 2006, you see an increase in public employment wages. The fact that now landless labor and even small marginal farmer had an alternative to go and work on the landlord's farm, thanks to MGNREGA, open market wages also rose. There was a knock-on effect on open market rural wages. So across the board, rural wages rose. So rural consumption has risen, as a result of which poverty has declined. We can come to that later. The important point is that as a result of the across the board rural wage increase, urban wages rose. Please remember, we were talking about construction employment rising. So demand for workers is rising. At the same time, rural wages have risen, so there's a knock-on effect on urban construction wages. So incomes across the board were really rising. Now, when unskilled wages rise in urban areas, then industry's immediate reaction is, let's cut down on the number of workers. Now, there's something else that happened. At the top end of the wage and skill distribution in our economy, because the economy was growing so rapidly, especially between 2003-04 and 2010-11, please recall that our economy grew at 8.4% per annum. The GDP was amazing. It's only in the last 2 years that it has declined. So when the economy is growing so rapidly, the demand for skilled wages also expands very quickly. So in some ways, salaried workers also, their wages, their salaries also rose very significantly, faster than productivity.
How much rural wages have increased, say, in the last 6-7 years? Since 2005?
Well, I don't exactly recall, but they would certainly in real terms have increased by 30 to 40%. In real terms, after allowing for inflation. Now, as a result of the skilled wages also rising faster than productivity, the response of employers, manufacturing employers, was that we will cut down on employment, we will employ more machines. So what you see is an increase in capital intensity, but there's something, this is the wage effect. Now, there's something else going on in the economy as to what explains manufacturing employment decline between 2005 and 2010. Look at the structure of manufacturing employment. You can see that while output grew, what was the nature of the output? You had a lot of consumer durables, and consumer durables are highly import intensive. So the import ratio of manufacturing employment systematically increased from the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade. Dramatic increase, in fact. So you had two types of imports taking place for manufacturing to grow. One was the capital goods import. So you see,
you're right. Even in telecom, for instance,
there you are.
It's a reason for our trade deficit also widening. Actually.
Yes, you see, one of the factors driving our current account deficit is the manufacturing deficit. Manufacturing trade deficit is what I'm saying. So there's capital goods imports. In addition, of course, the intermediate goods imports increase. So your coal, your steel, your all of this increases. So this is and this is a fair bit of this is imported. So both capital goods as well as intermediates are feeding into the manufacturing trade deficit. So as capital intensity increases, import intensity increases simultaneously. The technology that is coming in is also capital intensive.
That also in some sense creates jobless growth in manufacturing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a very interesting point. We'll take a small break here. Please don't go away. Welcome back to State of the Economy. Mr. Mehrotra, you were very rightly pointing out how the nature of manufacturing with technology intensive manufacturing may have created a situation of jobless growth in the sense a steel plant 20 years ago, 10 million ton steel plant would have accommodated maybe 70, 80,000 workers. Today, the same plant can be run by about 10, 15,000 workers. A power plant today, computerized a textile plant is run by a few hundred, maybe 1,000 people. So now, is that why coming back to the employment structure of our economy, is that why we have a situation today where nearly 50% of all incremental employment is in services? And a lot of this is also in very low-end services, which is not necessarily good for the economy. Very, very kind of low-wage shopkeepers in villages, disguised unemployment, 4 people sitting in a shop, whereas 2 of them probably should be finding work somewhere else?
Yes and no. Because the good part of the news is that even in rural areas, non-farm employment is what is driving employment increase. Yeah, it's non-farm employment. Now, let me come to the specific point that you made about services employment. Now, it's true, there's no question
I'm saying this because services shows an increase even during this period.
Quite right.
When agriculture and manufacturing employment declined in absolute terms.
Quite right. You see, but please remember that it's very important that people need to move out of agriculture. In this interim phase, until modern services grow, until manufacturing grows much more rapidly, and clearly policymakers need to focus on ensuring more rapid growth of modern services as well as manufacturing. And it's true that manufacturing employment, even in rural areas, the share has declined. What has driven, even in rural areas, non-farm employment? It's very important because what one is seeing is something very important happening in the economy. That rural wages have risen, rural consumption expenditure has risen, and as a result of which rural poverty is declining. Now, what's driving this? It's the rise in rural non-farm income, and some of that is precisely the services employment. Yes, relatively low productivity. I'm not denying that. Yes, relatively low productivity, but people have moved out of even lower casual agricultural wage. See, the divergence between non-farm wages and agricultural wages has increased. So people want to do other work than agricultural work. And the interesting thing is that while rural manufacturing might be declining, it's precisely the little shops, the repairman for tractors, for any equipment and mechanized.
That you've seen small towns, yeah.
Is right. The repair for the mobile, all of that. The repair for the TV, little hotels and dhabas and, transport and communications. This is a relatively thriving area of activity.
New area which is absorbing some
That's
employment.
right, in rural areas, which in some ways, which is all happening along highways, it's happening on the periphery of new towns,
Sure.
At the peri-urban edges of, all of this is happening in a big way. What is needed is clearly much greater support to clusters of manufacturing in order to encourage much more manufacturing employment, much more support perhaps to small shops like this on the financing side if we want to increase their activity. So there's a lot for policymakers to do.
And tell me, how do you explain in the context that you just laid out, this whole debate about withdrawal of women from the labor force in rural India on a fairly significant scale?
Right. Well, first let's recognize the following fact, that historically in economies, when women's engagement in education is low, then it does happen that over a period of time, as their engagement in education improves, in all low-income economies, the labor force participation rates of women declines. So, which is very good news. Half of the withdrawal we know is accounted for by the increase.
By the better status of the family, improving status of the family in terms of education and employment.
Absolutely. So, girl children.
But is this empirically determined?
Absolutely. No question. Because between the ages of 6 and 14, girls who were earlier working at home or working on the family farm, they are joining school. Primary enrollment is universal. Upper primary enrollment is dramatically increasing. Absolutely. All state governments are giving cycles to girls. So, first of all, child labor has declined. That's one dimension of the withdrawal. The second dimension of the withdrawal is that these teenage girls, the over 14-year-olds, who would otherwise be appearing in the labor force, they are seen to be withdrawing because now with the increase in the number of schools, secondary schools and the cycles, the girls are being sent off to secondary schools. They are continuing education. So this is another. At every level of education, women are withdrawing from, every level of age, I'm saying, women are withdrawing. So this is one.
But this is actually very true, because in all my visits to rural areas during elections, this is one question I ask in remote villages. How many girls went to school 10 years ago and now? And I would invariably get answer like maybe 2 out of 10, 15 years ago, today 9 out of 10. Even remote villages.
Absolutely. So this is a very welcome sign, but what is the implication of this? The implication is the following, that 3-4 years down the road, we will see these girls joining the labor force, but non-agricultural labor force, which is exactly the pattern of development, the structural change.
Create enough economic activity to absorb them, right?
That's very important. What the implication of that for policymakers is that these girls, as they complete, let's say, upper primary education, some of them will continue in secondary, but it also means that in secondary level, you have to provide these girls skills. And you have to make your cities safe enough for them, for the parents to allow them to actually, take up employment in Reliance Fresh or what have you, modern retail. Which is the pattern that you have seen in Bangkok and Manila and
So what
Jakarta.
you're saying that you might see in the next 5 years a lot more women coming into the urban labor force or peri-urban labor force and services, in manufacturing, etc.
Absolutely, because let us remember the following. As these girls acquire education, let us not expect that they will, like their mothers, be making bidis or agarbattis or doing zari zardoshi contract work.
The change in the structure of the economy.
Absolutely.
Driving that.
So they will have to be skilled. In order to enable them to actually join the modern labor force, as opposed to, it's very good news they're not going to be in agriculture.
So we are in the midst of a very dynamic process.
Absolutely.
Thanks for talking to us, Dr. Mehrotra. That's all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back next week. Thank you. Thanks for watching.